Hi, I'm Randy Christian with the Essential Faith Project, and we're making a series of podcasts to talk about the essentials of spiritual health. This is about discipleship, and discipleship is one of those buzzwords in the American church. Sometimes it's very popular, and then we go through a lack, and then we start doing it again. But often we don't really understand what we're talking about. It's a word that becomes a church word. And yet when you say, what is a disciple, or what does a disciple look like, or how can you be a healthy disciple of Jesus? We're not sure. So we want to make sure that everybody understands that the Bible gives us very clear instructions on how to be healthy disciples of Jesus. One of those ways is giving. And I know as soon as I say that, that's one of the things that everybody all of a sudden puts their screens up. And we've got to be careful of that because Jesus himself talked about giving a lot. It was a very important thing. In fact, the most consistent way that people in the Old Testament worshiped was through giving. And we're going to talk about the different kinds of giving in just a moment. But we need to be sure that we understand how important it is for us to be willing to do this. Now, I'm going to tell you, in decades of ministry, I was one of those guys who was not willing to talk about this very often. I hated talking about giving. And I think maybe it's because I went into ministry right about the same time as the people in televangelism and radio evangelism were being outed for their lavish lifestyles, for their greed, and for their focus on making themselves wealthy as opposed to serving other people. And so I did not want to be associated with that in any way. And as a result, I just wouldn't talk about it until I realized I was being unfaithful. That's not the way Jesus was. Jesus talked about it all the time because you can't be healthy as a disciple of Jesus without being healthy in your giving. So what are we talking about? Well, for a Christian, I want to suggest that we start with the tithe. And I realize that the tithe is part of the Old Testament law, and the Old Testament law does not bind us as Christians. But all of the Old Testament, according to Paul in Romans, is there for us to learn from. So we need to realize that the Old Testament law was not done away with. Jesus himself said, I've not come to do away with the smallest mark of the law, but to fulfill it. So the law is very important to us, and we need to realize that the tithe was given not just as a way of funding some things that were pretty important to fund, but also as a way to make sure that every individual understood that what they had because of God, because of his provision, and that their faithfulness to God, their worship to God was started on the basis of being willing to give part of that back. So the tithe, which by definition is a tenth, the tithe was something that they automatically collected. So if I am in the nation of Israel, a tithe would in most cases be primarily in terms of agricultural products because it was an agrarian society. So if I had crops, then 10% at the beginning of the harvest, I would estimate the harvest and then I would give 10% to the temple. If I had animals, then I would estimate what my increase would be in my flocks and my herds, and I would give 10% to the temple for them to use as they wished or to sell for the upkeep of the temple or for giving to the poor. Now, if at the end of the harvest, it turns out that I had underestimated and maybe only give 7%, then I would make up that 10% by giving another 3%. But in most cases, if I had given 10% and I had overestimated, I didn't go back to the temple and say, I need that back. No, that was something that I had given to the Lord in good faith. and I left that with him. I want to suggest that this is how we should begin giving. And I'm not saying it's a law. I'm not saying that we have to do it. But I will say this. The first Christians were all Jews. And they realized their salvation did not come from the law any more than for those of us who are Gentiles. But they continued to keep the law because they understood that the law was given for their own good. The law was spiritually beneficial to them. So the first Christians continued to tithe to the temple. But in addition to that, they tithed to the church. So I find it amusing today when people tell me that tithing is really hard for them, or they really struggle with this, or they just don't want to do it, because the reality is that the first Christians, tithing in the first 10% was the low bar. It was the starting point, not the finish point. And for many of us, we think if we give that 10% that we're somehow spiritual giants. Folks, that's not the way it works. When we give that first 10%, we're simply recognizing that our ability to earn money, and for most of us, it comes in terms of money instead of products, that money is given to us by God. And if you don't believe that, ask yourself this question. Who made you be born in this country with these opportunities? Did you do that yourself? Did you earn that somehow? Who gave you the DNA to give you the intelligence or the skills to earn the money? Who gave you the opportunities to do that? Are those all your own doing? Because I'm going to tell you right now, if you think that, then frankly, you're suffering from arrogance, and that's a spiritual problem. The reality is God gave you those things. And by tithing, we say to God, we understand, Lord, that these come from you, and we're grateful for them. And so we want to give a portion of them back for you to use as you see fit and as a way of us expressing how grateful we are. Now, that's the starting point. The early Christians also tithed to the church. Now, I'm not going to suggest that Christians need to tithe 20%. And by the way, let's deal with that. I said earlier that a tithe is 10%. I've had people say, well, I tithe 5%. No, you don't. You give half a tithe. Because again, by definition, tithe means 10%. We don't redefine it. So if you're not giving 10%, you're not tithing, period. So I'm not saying that we need to give 20% as the starting point. Although if you're capable of that, I think that's certainly not a bad idea. I've known people who have set their goal and made it to give 50%, literally 50% of their income. Now, these are people, frankly, who have very, very high incomes and can easily live off the other part. But they're not saying, well, I'm going to give the 10%, but the rest of it's mine, because they belong to Jesus and they recognize what they have belongs to Jesus as well. So once you give the 10%, maybe then you look at other things and you want to give. Maybe it's to benevolence. Maybe it's a special need that your congregation have. Maybe it's missions, a specific nonprofit. Maybe it's the Essential Faith Project. Who knows? But when you're doing that, now you're giving an offering. Okay. So when you say you give an offering, understand this. The tithe comes first, then the offering. You're not giving an offering if you haven't tithed. You're just giving the first portion of your tithe. So the tithe is the first 10%. What we give above that is an offering. And we can do that in several ways. We can give it to the church for specific needs. We can give it to the church just for whatever they choose to use it for. Or we can give it to other organizations that are doing good things that we want to support and in essence, worship God as we're giving these to him. If you're married, I want to strongly encourage you to do this together. Okay. Now, if you're unequally yoked, one of you is Christian, one of you is not, then that's probably not possible because the unbelieving spouse is not likely to be willing to do that. That's fine. The believing spouse needs to do what they can do. But the reason I say this is because I've known couples in the church, many couples, who have separated their finance and even spiritually separate them. Now, I can tell you, I've been a marriage and family counselor for over 40 years. And one of the worst things you can do is separate your finances like that. That creates mine and yours mentality instead of ours. And marriage is about ours. So when you're tithing, that's one of those things that you do as a couple. I usually give our tithe online, and Donna is not doing the bills. So I make a point of saying to her, this week we are tithing this much, so that she can spiritually offer that to the Lord just as I can. And maybe we sit down together and do that, whether it's in our living room or during a worship service, but it's still us together doing that. So I want to strongly encourage you, if you're not already doing this as something you do together, to begin to do so and to make sure that you're truly tithing together. Now, what if you have the ability and you're even doing it, but you just don't have the right attitude? I want to encourage you, not necessarily stop giving. Don't stop doing the part that you're doing right, but take that to the Lord. Tell the Lord, I am having a problem with this. I need my attitude changed. Help me to change my attitude. If you're married, do this together and then talk together about what God is doing with that tithe. What is God doing with what you have given? What do you see happening with the fruits of what you have donated? Because as you do this, you begin to understand more and more. Again, not only this is God's, not mine, but God knows better what to do with it than you do. And that's the truth. Finally, what if you're not doing this at all? How do you get started? I know people who are very strong proponents of, well, start off with 1%, start off with 5% or 3% or whatever it is that you can comfortably do. But in my experience, if you start off trying to do that, the reality is you simply won't. Because most people aren't comfortable doing it until they start doing it. I will say, depending on the time in my life and what God has allowed us to do, Donna and I have always tithed, and we've often tithed way over the 10% or given because God's allowed us to. And it's been very comfortable and it's been very enjoyable, literally. But it wasn't to start with. See, to start with, it was new, it was different, it was a discipline. So I want to challenge you. Begin to do that now. One other thing that I'm going to say on behalf of those who serve in your church, because having served in a local church for 45 years, I know the attitude is often, wait a minute, you guys are just doing this to serve yourselves. This is where you get your money. I've had people look me in the eye and say, you're just trying to get rich. And I'd laugh my head off at them because I know their salary and I know mine. And they weren't even close. So here's what I suggest. If you have that attitude, this is not about your pastor's salary or even the budget of your church. What I'm talking about is your spiritual health. So start tithing immediately. But if you have that attitude and you think it's just them asking me for money for themselves, then give it to another church instead. And if you're not sure what other church to give it to, ask them. Tell them what you're doing and ask them. I've done that for years. I learned that I could get over that hesitance to talk about giving by simply saying, look, if you think this is about me, no problem. You write the check, write it to another church. It will be given to that other church without question. And I mean, without question, I don't even know how many people did that. I know some did because I've heard reports that they have, but I don't know who did it and I don't know how much because I refuse to know. I don't want to know those things. Instead, what I want to know is that we as Christians are understanding what we need to do in order to be healthy, because this is how God created us. I hope this was useful to you. I want to encourage you to go into the information section on this video on YouTube and click on the link that takes you to Essential Faith Project, and it's specifically going to take you straight to a sign up for the spiritual health assessment. This is a tool that is totally free and totally confidential, and what it does is ask you a number of questions. It takes about 5 minutes to do, and then gives you feedback on where you are with regard to the different essentials in your discipleship. Then it gives you some guidance as to what you can do in order to strengthen that area of your discipleship. It's very, very important to take that from the academic down to the personal. Now, this ministry is 100% donation based. So if you would like to support us, I want to encourage you to go to www.essentialfaithproject.org/donate, and you can make your donation there. In the meantime, I want to encourage you to subscribe and tell your friends and your church leaders, know Jesus and be faithful.